All right, and what you have is J-curve growth. All right, and then in this case, the S-curve is going to have to be generalized like this. Okay, but what you see with that S-curve is that as the population goes up, you have something called an overshoot. And an overshoot occurs when you go above the carrying capacity, which means that the ecosystem cannot support that many. And then what happens is you end up with these different factors starting affecting your population called density-dependent variables, and they'll kick the population back down. That could be starvation, it could be disease, something where you have too many in a small area. Then once you go below carrying capacity, all of a sudden the resources become available again, and the population goes back up. You overshoot again, and your population goes down, and then you should, over time, slowly work your way right towards carrying capacity. You are always going to have years where you have a few more and a few less, but generally you'll be right around the carrying capacity. And it just takes a little bit of time to hit equilibrium, right at your carrying capacity. But there are some populations who don't follow that rule, and they go through what they call eruptive cycles. All right, and this happens to be one down here at the bottom of raccoons that they did a study. And you could see that there are periods in 1887 and again in 1899 where the raccoon population just skyrocketed and then went back down. You can also say 1875. But you have this eruptive cycle and then down, eruptive, down, and then it kind of stabilizes, and then all of a sudden again it goes up and then back down. Eruptive occurs usually because of some changes within the environment, where you have a species with a tremendous biotic potential, and so you end up with this type of eruptive explosion of populations. And you'll see that periodically. Be ready, understand the idea of eruptive cycles, and we'll talk about them as we apply it to some real life examples. All right, and these density dependent factors, which I mentioned, just to give you some official definitions. Okay, density dependent meaning that it depends on it's dependent upon the density of the population. So there's so many of them. Okay, and those things that where the density gets so great, it's much easier for predators. So you have predation start getting stronger. Disease starts taking over. Okay, competition within a species called intraspecific competition, meaning competition within a species, and also interspecific competition, meaning with other species. These are density-dependent variables, and these are two very important terms, intraspecific and interspecific. Intra, like intramural sports, is within a school. Intramural sports within a school. Intraspecific is within a species. All right. These are density-dependent variables. All right. They are the ones that once you overshoot, they're going to be the ones that bring you back down. Or they will also be the ones when you get near carrying capacity to keep you there. All right. What are some of these factors if you go density independent versus density dependent? This is not the clearest of charts. Density independent means that it doesn't matter what the density of the population is, it's going to affect the population. And these are usually natural disasters. Flood, fires, okay, humans come and spray with pesticides, climate change, okay, drought, somehow we burn a forest. These are things that it's going to hurt your population no matter if you have a lot within an area or a few. And then the density dependent ones are the ones we just talked about, okay, where you have a food shortage and starvation, you have competition, okay, you have diseases, those kind of things. All right, increased predation, there's so many. So you get the idea. I just wanted to review that with you to make sure you get the idea between the two. All right, let's clear that, and let's move on. All right, the next thing that affects a wildlife population, okay, and I zipped right through a whole bunch of information, so please read through it very carefully. Come back to me if you have any additional questions. All right, so now let's look inside a species, intraspecific factor that affects the population. So far we've been looking at external things, interspecific things that affect the population, like disease or predators or food or whatever. But what about the species themselves? All right, that's what we're going to talk about right now. We're going to look at the species themselves. So the first thing is this concept called survivorship curves. And there's a nice little description there, but I'm going to go through it very simply with you, okay, where it's a graph. It's seen best in a graph that shows the ability for a species to survive throughout its lifespan. Now, we're talking about throughout a lifespan of an entire population. So you have three types. You have one that lives a long time, for a very long time, and then they all seem to die out at the end. You have a second, which right from birth, which is over here, this is birth, the population begins to decline all the way down throughout its entire lifespan. You have a steady arithmetic rate of decrease. And then you have a third type, and this one actually has four, but we're going to just stick with the third. The third type is where you have many of the young die, and then only a few make it to adulthood. Okay? And we give these four, or these three curves, we call them, I guess, even when we say give them a name, they're called type 1 species, type 2 species, and type 3 species, in case you couldn't guess. All right, type 1 species is the species that lives relatively long lives, and then all die out at the end. All right, we call that a type 1 species. And humans are type 1. Most humans are born, and a large majority of our population continues to live. It drops off a little bit, but when you get near our end of our lifespan, then you see a large drop-off. That's perfect for humans. Now, the big difference is type 1, where it's a long lifespan and most mature and survive through maturity. And type 3, where you have very, very, very few survive to adulthood, where the population is decimated in the beginning and then a few remain. Okay? That's called a type 3. And there you're talking about many of our plants, or more specifically, you can go to mice, where very few make it to adulthood. Rabbits. Well, rabbits are a little bit closer to type 2, but you can go with where you have a tremendous number of young being born. Again, Darwin thought, why does a mating pair have so many offspring? And the idea is that they need to, because so few survive to adulthood in many species. And so it's the ones that have the right traits that can make it through adulthood down here. The ones that don't make it through adulthood. Okay? Now, you all know the story of the cane toad. In its native Hawaii, the cane toad was actually a type 3 species, where in Hawaii, when the cane toad was born, it was all its eggs were eaten. Very few actually made it to adulthood, and the population was stabilized. But when they moved it to Australia, then it changed. It was no longer a type 3. It was now a type 1, like humans, where instead of most of their offspring being killed or eaten, they all survived to adulthood. Now, that's important, because in order to be a type 3 species, in order to have a few survive, you need to have a massive population to start off with. Okay? So you must have a large population to start off with, because only a few make it to the end. But if you're a type 1 species, you don't want to have too many young, because most of them survive to the end. The cane toad, unfortunately, went from being a type 3 to being a type 1, and still had the huge biotic potential. Lots and lots of young, and that's why it just spread like crazy. All right, so these survivorship curves do have application, all right, in many cases. All right, now, just underneath the survivorship curves, we're going to talk about these abilities or strategies for species to increase their population. If you're a mouthist, Okay, the strategies, they're externally controlled, meaning that you have external things that control your population growth. Okay, and these are usually insects, rodents, invertebrates, parasites, plants. They are controlled by external factors. You also have logistic strategies, intrinsically controlled factors. All right, and those are wolves, elephants, okay, whales, primates. They have their population is usually not controlled by external forces, but by internal. Okay, they're not prey so much. Okay, there's things happen within the species that controls its population. And so this chart below, and you don't have to memorize this whole chart, but I just want you to see that these are the intrinsically controlled, these are the externally controlled. And it gives you the characteristics of what they are. All right, and we're going to kind of come back to this, but if you look at it, like externally controlled are your pioneer plants that you know about. They're usually the prey. Okay, they're usually what we call generalists, which you're going to learn all about. They usually have many offspring. Okay, early maturity, rapid growth, very short life, and then these guys are all the opposite. Okay, so you have two different kind of strategies for growing your population. One is externally controlled, one is internally controlled. Let's start with the externally controlled ones. We give them a name, and there's a chart in your notes,